Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I'd like to talk to you about what's going on in the Russian economy and specifically to talk about oil and gas revenues because Russia is still entirely dependent on the sale of oil and gas, predominantly oil these days, because its gas business has been decimated by the sanctions because it was selling the vast majority of its gas reserves into Europe through the pipelines. Europe no longer wants to buy that gas. So Russia is now really fully dependent on oil. And the figures for 2025 have now been released, and they show that the Russian oil industry is really suffering right now as a result of the combination of the sanctions and also the drone attacks that are now targeting oil infrastructure within Russia. We'll go on to have a look at the figures in a moment, but the headlines are that in 2025, total revenue was down by 24% against the previous year and was the lowest since the start of the war in Ukraine. And all of this actually doesn't really take much account of the direct sanctions that have now been applied against Rosneft and Lukoil, the two biggest oil producers in Russia. If you have a look at this chart, it shows oil and gas revenues for Russia in Russian rubles. So the scale on the right hand side is in trillions of rubles, and that's a big number, obviously, a trillion rubles. But you have to take into account that the exchange rate between the ruble and the dollar is around about 80 to 1. So you can divide that figure, roughly speaking, by 100 to get to where we are in US dollars. But if we keep it simple and just look at Russian rubles for the time being, this scale goes from 0 at the bottom to 12 trillion at the top. But it's all relative anyway. That's the whole point of a graph, is to show you whether things are better or worse than they were previously. Now, the blue section at the top here shows the gas revenues, and the black section shows the oil revenues, which is quite suitable, isn't it? Black for oil. Not sure blue for gas. Is blue for gas? I guess it probably is when it's burning. So, as I said at the start of today's video, the gas revenues, you can see in 2022, that was a record-breaking year for Russia, which may sound quite bizarre because that was the year when the war started. However, the problem that Europe had was that they were totally dependent on Russian gas at that point. And so it was very difficult to switch away from buying Russian gas. So Europe actually continued buying large quantities because they'd set up all of these power stations to produce electricity all across Europe. And they were being fed by gas through these pipelines. And it was difficult to replace that overnight because they then had to look at alternative sources. They couldn't find another way of filling the pipelines. And so they had to get liquefied natural gas and then convert it back into gas. So it took a while for Europe to lose its dependence. It's like any addiction, I guess. It takes a while to get over it. And also, because of what was happening in Ukraine, gas prices went sky high. So it was a bumper year for Russia. So when you look at the total revenue, actually, if you take a step back, 2022, it looked like the war was going to be good news for Russia because the price of everything went up and it was still selling huge volumes. But as you can see, over the past 3 years, the amount of revenue Russia's earning from gas sales has reduced significantly. So in 2025, it was down to its lowest level since the start of the war in Ukraine. Now, if we look at the oil revenues, you can see that in 2022, it was a similar-ish story that the total revenue from oil sales went up. And that was partly as a result of the fact that prices across the globe spiked following the invasion of Ukraine. And also, in the same way as we were talking about for gas, people were dependent on Russian oil. So it became quite difficult to really switch away from it overnight. And then over the past 3 years, we've seen a sort of two different stories. In 2023, revenue started going down for oil. And this was as Russia started to feel the pain of the sanctions. Europe stopped buying lots of oil and it was looking for new buyers. And obviously, India stepped into the breach. They'd never bought any Russian oil historically because it was too expensive to export it to India. But as a result of the fact that Europe had turned its back on Russia, Russia offered huge discounts to India, and so it started buying large volumes. At one point, it was buying 2 million barrels of oil per day. So things started to pick up in 2024. So you can see that in 2024, total revenue was close to what it was in 2022 and was actually higher than it had been in 2021. So once again, it looked like Russia had evaded the impact of the sanctions and was doing better than it had done historically. If you look back at 2018 and 2019, 2024 was actually better. But the point of today's video is really to look at 2025 revenues. Now, as I said, total revenue is down by 24%, and the majority of that has come from what's happening with oil. And oil sales are really suffering at the moment as a combination of the fact that the sanctions have really stepped up. So we've seen the two biggest oil companies in Russia being hit with direct sanctions. So they can no longer sell directly to anybody in the world without the buyer running the risk of being hit with secondary sanctions. So that's really putting India and China off from continuing to trade. However, these figures don't really take that into account because that sanction was only introduced at the end of November. So already before that heavy duty sanction was imposed, we'd seen a pullback in the total volume and value of Russian oil sales. We'll have a look at the value in a moment. But in terms of what happened with oil revenue, it fell from 9.2 trillion rubles in 2024 to 7.1 trillion, which represented a fall of 22.5%. And that was before we really seen the sanctions hitting home. So that's a big concern from Russia's point of view. Now, one of the problems that Russia has is that it's now having to offer bigger and bigger discounts. But as well as that, we're also seeing Russian oil companies having a problem with the strength of the ruble. Now, that might sound like a bizarre statement because normally you would expect if your economy is doing well, then your currency is doing well. And the fact that the ruble has strengthened quite a lot over the past 12 months, it's now playing at around about 80 against one US dollar compared with 100 to one US dollar. So that represents, 20, 25% improvement in the value of the ruble over the past 12 months. So you would have thought that would benefit Russian companies. But actually, when you're exporting, if your currency strengthens, then it's going to represent bad news when you're converting all of that revenue back into rubles. And that's what Russian oil companies have to do. If they sell a barrel of oil for $50, they can't report those $50 on their accounts in Russia. They have to convert it back into rubles. And because the ruble is strong, it translates back into a lower amount of rubles. So if you have a look at this chart, it shows what's been happening with the rubles per barrel reported from Russia's perspective. So you can see the Urals price here, and we're looking at rubles per barrel. And you can see that since January 25, there has been a significant reduction in the amount that Russian oil companies are receiving in rubles. And that is a combination of two factors. Firstly, global oil prices have gone down since the start of 2025. So everybody is selling their oil for less than they were 12 months ago. But it's much worse for Russian oil companies because they're offering a discount against the global price. And that was roughly running at around about $10 to $20 per barrel. However, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that currently, where oil prices are sitting at around about $60, Russia is now having to sell its oil at $35 per barrel because nobody wants to buy it because it's just too risky. If you buy it and you get caught, then you will be hit with secondary sanctions. That basically means you're out of business because you won't be able to use international payment methods. You won't be able to deal with anybody else because you're sanctioned. And so everybody's pulling back from buying Russian oil. And so it's having to offer bigger and bigger discounts. And that's killing Russian oil companies because they've got a double whammy of lower prices. And then they're having to convert those lower prices into rubles. And because the ruble is strong, it's resulting in low revenue from Russian oil companies' perspective. So the overall summary of today's video is that what we've seen in 2025 is a sharp reduction in oil and gas revenues for Russia. They're down by 24%, which is bad news in itself. Obviously, that's not going to convert into a lot of tax, and therefore the Russian economy is going to suffer. But when you look at what's happened over the past few months, things have really accelerated because we've got the sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft in place now. We're also seeing stronger policing. we've seen a change to the price cap. So previously, the price cap was set at $60 per barrel. That wasn't really working because oil prices are down to $60 per barrel and Russia's selling at a discount. So basically, the price cap was redundant at that point. So it was changed up to be a 15% discount against the current market levels. So the price cap is now coming down along with global oil prices. So it's much more dynamic. And in addition to that, we're also seeing the insurance companies that are insuring the tankers are really focusing in on applying the sanctions against those tankers. So more and more tankers are finding it difficult to get insurance. The dark shadow fleet isn't able to get any insurance from the West. And so it's having to rely on Russian companies and other companies that are favorable towards Russia, but they're struggling to get that. And in addition to all of this, there is a lot of oil that is now sitting in tankers on the sea because they can't actually unload the oil because the buyers no longer want to go through with the purchases. So Russia is being squeezed from all sides. We're seeing the impact of that now starting to manifest itself in the revenues. And this is really the biggest focus that the world has in terms of trying to force Russia to come to a conclusion on the war in Ukraine. The financial sanctions will hurt the Russian economy more in 2026 than they did in 2025. But 2025 was a very bad year for the Russian oil and gas industry, and that means a bad year for the Russian economy. And if this continues, then Russia at some point will continue to see its revenue crashing and just won't be able to balance the books. It will have to take on more and more debt. And I'm currently working on a video, so have a look for that one because I think that's some really interesting data as well. So thank you so much for watching this video all the way through to the end. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. It really helps with the algorithm. It doesn't take you a second to hit that red button, so please do that now. Also, I'd like to remind you that I'm currently running my competition whereby you can win my house located close to one of the best beaches in the whole of the UK or an alternative cash prize of £250,000, whichever you prefer. It's another way of funding the channel, so if you'd like to get involved and help me, then have a look at the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below. That'll take you through to the independent company that's hosting that competition for me. They'll be choosing the winner at random. Thank you so much to everyone who supported me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron, YouTube member or buy me a coffee member, really, really appreciate that support. Thank you so much. And here's something to put a smile on your face.